of a handful of prebiotic fibers. So how much should you eat? Well, entry-level dosage is about 30 grams a day. If you eat more, there seems to be more protection. But the problem is hardly anyone, thanks to the modern diet, which has become such a terrible diet, no one is eating enough fiber. 9 out of 10 don't. The average intake of fiber is only half of the minimum recommended level of intake. So what do the WHO and my fellow clinicians recommend? Well, they say you should eat wholemeal breads and cereals, jacket potatoes, fruits and vegetables. Nonsense. Actually, if I may drop into the argot, into the street parlance for a moment, bullshit. These are not good sources of prebiotic fibers. They're reasonable sources of other types of fibers, such as cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, things like that. But they're really not very interesting. They're inert. They're not fuel for the right microbes. They just go all the way through you. There are other sources of the prebiotic fibers that you really need. So they rebalance the microbiome. You start producing butyrate. The bugs that produce butyrate, they are associated with well-being and hugely extended long-term health. The average diet contains 15 grams of total fiber. I've done a little bit of digging into this. I think that top figure is quite well known, but how much of that is prebiotic? Well, the answer to that is today, only a quarter. So people are actually only eating an average of 3.5 grams of prebiotic fiber a day. The WHO data suggests we should all be eating at least 7, probably 10 is better if you really look through the math. And we've designed Xenobiotic to give you in a single scoop between 7 and 8 grams of prebiotic fibers. This is the level of fiber intake that is associated with all of those health benefits that I listed in the previous slide. What are the fibers? Well, you have to use a mix of fibers. You need fibers of different chain lengths because different chain lengths are fermented at different rates. So these are very short chain prebiotic fibers. This is known as FOS, or fructooligosaccharides. And when the bacteria start to consume these fibers, they consume them as if they were beads on a chain. So it will start with the end fructose, and then the next one, and then the next one, and until it comes to the final glucose. It's a short chain, so this is a short fermentation reaction. It takes place fairly quickly, which is why we always combine this with the larger amounts of inulin. Same structure, longer fibers, slower fermentation. We combine that with larger amounts of 1,3,1,4 beta-glucans, which you can characteristically obtain from oats. Longer fiber again, more complicated, slower fermentation, and the heavy lifting, if you like, is done by this molecule, which is a resistant starch. There's different forms of resistant starch. You can get these, for example, from green bananas. They're a good source. Or you can form retrograde crystallization resistant starch by taking a carbohydrate-rich food and taking it through a number of heating and cooling cycles. And the more you do that, the more ordinary starch becomes resistant starch and takes on this kind of structure and becomes a prebiotic. Now, you need to have all of these different fibers with different chain lengths and different fermentation rates because of the way these fibers pass through the gut. Now, these fibers will go all the way through the small intestine. They enter the large intestine at the ileocecal junction. So that's over on the left, that's the ascending colon. And once this mixture enters, it is the very short chain fibers, the FOS, fructooligosaccharides, that start to ferment first. You really don't want too much of these, because if you have too much, you will have bloating, you'll have diarrhea, flatulence, pain, abdominal distension, not a good idea. And all the FOS is used up fairly quickly. So by the time you get to the top of the ascending colon, it's gone. You've now created a large number of the right bacteria, but you've taken away their food source. And if you do that, they have a portfolio of different metabolic systems. They then switch to other fuel sources and produce compounds which are not very good for you at all. So I do not recommend using only FOS, or indeed any one fiber type. Think of it as a relay race. As the FOS is consumed, the bacteria that are now growing, the gram-positive bacteria, the good ones, now want more energy, and you give them the slower fermenting inulin. That keeps the fermentation growing and the numbers of the right bacteria growing until that is used up and is taken over by the 1,3,1,4 beta glucans from the oats, and then finally the resistant starch. And in this way, you're transforming the entire colonic microbiota, shifting all of it en masse away from gram-negative, pro-inflammatory, associated with higher cancer risk and all those other things I told you about before. Now you're moving towards a reduction of chronic inflammatory stress and a reduction, according to the WHO data, of a whole range of different kinds of other risks. I talked briefly about trauma-related brain damage. I'll talk a little bit about gum disease, which I have to say xenobiotic does not address, but the gum is at the beginning of the gastrointestinal tract, the gums, the oral cavity, the oropharynx, and there you have a different microbiota. And if you have the wrong microbiota there, that has now been associated with all kinds of other problems, increasing the risk of Parkinsonism. We think that various inflammatory compounds and bacterial compounds, if you have the wrong microbes in the oropharynx, are producing potentially toxic compounds, which are moving through the olfactory nerve and getting into the brain that way. If you're producing those toxic compounds in the gut, they can get into the brain through the vagus nerve. Gum disease also associated with rheumatoid arthritis, that's very new, and gastric, breast, and esophageal and pancreatic cancers. So even although we're talking about xenobiotic, prebiotic fibers for the lower intestine, addressing dysbiosis in the mouth is an important issue, and it's something we could perhaps talk about. If anyone is interested, we can bring that up in the questions. Gender dysphoria comes in here, the estrobolome. This is the totality of the microbes in the gut that are involved in the metabolism of estrogen as it is cycled through the enterohepatic circulation. You can form estrogen metabolites, which are more or less carcinogenic. You can drain the estrogen pool. This has an overall effect on, amongst other things, breast cancer risk, but also the levels of estrogen floating around in the blood undoubtedly have an impact on gender and people's feelings about their own gender. COVID, yes, the microbiota. If you have an unhealthy microbiota, that certainly is going to make you more at risk of serious COVID and possibly even COVID fatality, because we know that the COVID virus is able to hang around in a dysbiotic colon in a way that it is not able to do in a colon where the microbiota has been rectified using a pre-industrial input, and many other conditions as well. Listen, I started late for reasons I tried to, I explained at the beginning. I do apologize. So I kind of rushed through this, but what I'm hoping is that there will be time to answer the questions that hopefully I've stimulated amongst you, the audience.
Oh, wonderful, Dr. Paul. I know you were a bit late coming on, and that you can't do anything about traffic, dear. So, but you know, we did have some questions at the beginning, and those are the questions I'm going to ask. So, in regarding dosage, one of the things I think some of us have noticed at different places around the world, you know, that one scoop that we want to take of this xenobiotic, that can be too much for many people. So sometimes I've recommended when people have issues just to take that quarter of a scoop and take that for a while, or a half a scoop, and then keep working your way up to the dose that you want to get to. Because as you said, some people have issues right away. What would you say about the dosage, and what would you say about when people have these different issues of bloating, or, right, you know, you can hear it going in there. Some people are taking it.
Yeah, some people are more sensitive than others. Some people, and I mean, for example, I've started on a one scoop right away, and I'm currently on, I sort of vary between 1 and 1.5. I mean, I'm very comfortable with that. But some people will have problems to begin with at that dose. And what's happening is you're adding something new to the diet. This is getting into the large intestine. The right bacteria are really happy to see it there. But because there is a kind of it's an entire ecosystem basically, and they're fighting their corner against the various other bacteria. If you have a certain kind of overall bacterial configuration, by taking some more, even small amounts of these prebiotic fibers, it can create discomfort. So for people who have that problem, if they start off with a scoop and really are very uncomfortable, go back, just take a quarter of a scoop, maybe a quarter, and for in the morning for 2 or 3 days. And if you can tolerate that, go to add another quarter in the second half of the day. So you're now taking a quarter in the morning, quarter in the evening, and almost everybody can do that. And then build up a little bit of a tolerance. Let the new order settle in the large bowel, and things become easier. Now there is a small number there are small numbers of people who can't even go through that because they have SIB, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO. And for them, they can't be eating these prebiotic fibers at all because they've got the right bacteria, the gram-positive saccharolytic species, the ones we like, but they're in the wrong place. They're in the small intestine. And we are seeing more people with SIBO these days, and the industrial diet is doing that as well. Because if you're eating a bad diet and you have a lot of chronic inflammatory stress in the large bowel, this can damage the ileocecal valve, allowing some of the good bacteria to get up into the small bowel, where if you feed them with the right fibers, with prebiotic fibers, they're producing butyrate and hydrogen, and the small intestine distends, and it's really not set up to be able to do that, and it's really painful. If this is your problem, you can't take even small doses of xenobiotic. You have to normalize the microbiota in the small intestine first before you can then move on to using xenobiotic.
Well, that is really important to know. Wonderful information there. Are there any other reasons that you wouldn't be taking xenobiotic?
If you have had for whatever reason, it might be because you've had colorectal cancer, or you've had very, really severe ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. If the colon has been removed, then there is no point in taking xenobiotic.
Okay. So what about if people some people are having like a constipation at some time, even if they're taking more water, they're drinking more water, what is the cause of that?
Well, because you also need, in addition to being hydrated, in addition to having the right sort of profile of microbes, you also need some of that insoluble, inert, indigestible fiber that I was referring to before. And that's what the governments say: eat more, fruits and vegetables and whole grains. They are sources of, amongst other things, these other types of fibers, which you can't digest. The bacteria can't digest them either. There are things like cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. We don't eat very much lignin, small amounts of it, but we do need a certain amounts of these inert fibers because they provide bulk, and they provide they act to retain moisture. And then if you don't have any of them, the contents of the gut will tend to dry out, and then you're moving towards constipation. So the best source that I know of cellulose, you could just eat paper. Paper consists of cellulose. But in terms of foodstuffs, probably green beans are as good a source as any. Okay.
Very interesting there. Okay, so are there any like if people have a celiac or something, because those are people that are allergic to things, is there anything like that we would have to be worried about in regards to xenobiotic?
No, because xenobiotic does not contain gluten. I mean, when you look at the sources of the different fibers, they include artichokes, which do not contain inulin, oats, which barely have any at all. I mean, most celiacs can eat oats; they can't eat flour. And resistant starches from sources such as green banana. There's no gluten in green banana either. So we've had a lot of celiacs who have been able to use xenobiotic and do so with no problems at all.
Wonderful. So, Dr. Paul, is there anything when people have reduced immune system, if they're going through something that their immune system is compromised, sometimes after cancer treatments and things like that. Is there issues with that, or does it take longer? Is the process taking more time for them to get their gut in balance?
No. Once you start taking xenobiotic, the impact on the microbiota is really very rapid. And it will be very significant by day 2. It'll be complete by day 3. It ramps up very, very quickly because the doubling time of these microbes, they multiply very, very quickly. And as soon as you start providing these fibers, the right types of bacteria start to double, and they're doubling every 8 or every 10 hours. And that pretty soon adds up. So it happens very quickly. I would say that for anyone who has been taking, let's say, chemo, or one of the problems of the old-fashioned type of chemo, I'm not talking about the biologicals now, is that it damages rapidly growing cells. So, for example, those cells that you find that lining the intestine. So you end up with a lot of gastrointestinal problems. Under those conditions, you really do not want a pro-inflammatory microbiota. You want an anti-inflammatory microbiota. So xenobiotic is something that I would absolutely recommend to anyone who was either being subjected to chemotherapy or was due to be subjected to it.
Wonderful. Well, we know how important all of this is, and we have heard the stories, Dr. Paul, of so many people having their health changed around just from taking the health protocol, and we know how important the gut-brain connection is and how important that microbiome is. I have one last thing here, and that is, some people have been asking about heating it and using it in food, also in regards to kids and things like that. I'm pretty sure we can do that. I know my daughter and I have been baking different things, and you can put it into cookies. And what would you say about that?
Well, the fibers, luckily for us, are thermally stable. So you can mix them into yogurt or custard or ice cream or soup or stew, or you can bake them. You can bake with them. You can add them to flour and bake them into what you call cookies. We call biscuits or breads or anything you like, really. And as for children, I don't think you can start with a healthy microbiome too young. There are huge problems with ultra-processed children's foods. They are full of so much sugar and so much salt. The Association of Pediatricians in a number of different countries now have called this an absolute scandal that the food multinational are selling foods to our kids that are really damaging their microbiotas and are damaging their health in all kinds of other ways as well. It's the reason why children's health is so poor today. So I would say that as soon as a child has been weaned, I think it's a very good argument to be made for starting them on on foods which have reasonable amounts of prebiotic fibers. Things like artichokes. Whole grains have a place in there too, green bananas. Or if they don't like any of those things, you can just mix a little bit of xenobiotic into whatever it is they are eating. When I designed it, it was a labor of love because each of these different fiber lengths has a different fermentation rate. It's acting at different points in the gut. It has a different therapeutic index. So the fast fermenting ones, if you take too many of them, you have real problems. The very slow fermenting ones, you can take larger amounts of without problems. So it was all calculated on the back of a very large envelope, how we could put all these fibers together in a way that would be well tolerated, would give you protection throughout the whole large bowel, but would also taste good. Because what I've learned in all my years working in this sector, you can come up with a wonderful formulation, but if it tastes really bad, children won't eat it. And after a week or so, adults won't eat it either. So I think I was able to end up with a powder that tastes quite nice. It's quite sweet, but very faintly sweet. It's got a kind of nutty, oaty flavor to it. And in the morning, if I don't have time to mix it into yogurt or anything, I'll just take a scoop, put it straight in my mouth. And my kids do the same thing. Now be careful, don't inhale it. You don't want that. You don't want these bacteria growing in your lungs in large amounts. So it's not something I would necessarily recommend you do at home. I would still say mix it into something like yogurt. It's a very easy thing to do. but it tastes good enough so that you can eat it neat if you want.
I love that. So one last question here. I know that one of the reasons that you're working with Health Protocol and really working with Zenzino in regards to the vision that we have of really making an impact globally on world health. And I know that you've mentioned some things about what you see in the future if we can really do what we want to do here. But could you just sum up if we're really going to do for those who can take the xenobiotic, which is most of the world's population, what will this do for people taking our health protocol, including that xenobiotic? What would you say to that question?
Well, when you take the whole health protocol, you are you're putting yourself, your metabolism into a time machine, and you're sending it back 150 years in time, back to the mid-Victorian era, which is, we now know, is one of the biggest of all the so-called blue zones. And that was a population that had a life expectancy pretty similar to ours, but they had very little degenerative disease, only at levels of, as far as we can tell, about 10% of what we see today. And the same thing is true of the so-called vestigial groups, the smaller vestigial groups that still exist in far-flung corners of the world today. So we can dramatically reduce the burden of chronic degenerative disease, which we now know is nothing to do with wear and tear. It's actually caused by chronic poisoning caused by the modern industrial diet and lifestyle. It's really, really important because, as I said right at the outset, our public health, it's in a dark place and it's getting worse. And the drug model, the pharmaceutical model, has completely failed to prevent this. Put together a health protocol which basically consists of the antidotes to these damaging mechanisms. We're seeing remarkable stories. People are almost getting up off their deathbeds and learning how to square dance. And an MS patient who I know personally, who was getting to the point they'd moved past the sticks, they were on a Zimmer, they were starting to be wheelchair bound. And I talked about her before. The last time I talked to her, she'd bought her first pair of shoes with heels. I mean, not absolute high heels, but reasonable heels, which she hadn't been able to trust, for almost 10 years. The amount of regeneration that the human body is capable of healing, that it can actually do for itself, if you give it what it needs, is amazing. Now, I never learned this at medical school. And I think for mediconomic reasons, because our corrupt and idiotic politicians are dragging our economies into the ground, and the healthcare system is failing because it's ruinously expensive, and it's only run in the way that it is because the pharmaceutical company hires so many political whores to do their bidding. We've ended up with, amongst other things, the nightmare of not COVID, but the government responses to COVID, which have been so destructive that better scientists and clinicians than I am have referred to it as the greatest public health episode of malpractice of all time. This has led to a collapse of confidence in the government regulatory agencies because clearly they're in the pockets of big pharma. It's led to a collapse of confidence in orthodox pharmaceutical medicine across the board, which I share. And it has led people to pay more attention to keeping themselves healthy, which you can do with enhanced nutrition, which is where we are. We, I think, are the harbingers of the next wave of public health. Drugs won't do it. They can't do it. Supplements have not been able to do it because the supplement industry is so hopelessly off target. In fish oil, which is one of the biggest sectors in the market, doesn't do a damn thing because it's so poorly formulated. So in between these two failing Goliaths, here we come. We're this little guy with a sling. We're David. We're wandering through here. Well, look, we've found a middle way. And the case histories, which so many of us have now seen, these remarkable case histories, more and more of them are being picked up by doctors. And more doctors are contacting us to say, what is this? Because they've never seen that before. It's going to go even more rapidly into a higher gear when the results of our clinical trial are published, because they're dramatic, They are groundbreaking. They're going to make a lot of people understand for the first time what pharmaconutrition is. And I think they're going to open the floodgates. I have a new book which is going to come out at the same time. There's been an Oscar-winning filmmaker has been dogging me for the last 3 years, filming what I'm doing. He's actually already been to speak to the doctors who ran that trial. It also includes a very famous actor who was practically dying, who's now sprung back to life and is now appearing on silver screens all over the world. We are achieving the most amazing dramatic results. We are the way forwards. And Zinzino has given me the chance to develop these strategies. And Zinzino is the leading player by a long way in what this new sector of healthcare is. So tomorrow, I think tomorrow belongs to us.
I love it, Dr. Paul. Well, I am so grateful that you were able to come on here. This was absolutely marvelous. I want everyone to know, if you're going to look for more things of Dr. Paul Clayton, his blog is drpaulclayton.eu. So find him there. Thank you, Dr. Paul, for your time, and for everybody tuning in today and sending this on recording. Thank you all for being on. We are the future. Let's get out there and let more people know. Thanks, everybody. I'll let you all unmute. And thank you, Dr. Paul, for your time.
Thank you, Dr.
Paul.
Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carla. Great
Thank
job.
you, Dr. Paul.
Good to
Thank
see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.